Now on Overnights,
I believe in reason and common sense.
Leith Van Onselen from Macro Business with the treasury of common sense.
Common sense never goes out of style.
That's what they say. Mr. Van Onselen is, of course, the co-founder of Macro Business and chief economist of the MB Fund and MB Super, and he's on the line. Good morning, Leith. How are you?
G'day, Mike. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. I don't know why. There's no real excuse for it, but I just feel really well lately. Is there any reason for me to be optimistic, do you think? A general shift in the world? What do you think?
Well, it depends, mate. Are you carrying a big mortgage? Because if you're carrying a big mortgage, the chances are that rates are going to fall sooner than later. So I guess that's reasonably optimistic if you're in that position.
I'm looking at the numbers and, there's Smile and Jim telling us how wonderful they all are. But when it comes right down to it for the folks, we're actually continuing, not at such a fast clip, but we're continuing to pay more for stuff that we can't do without, like groceries.
Yeah, we are, mate. Yeah, and obviously energy's a big one.
Yes.
Obviously gas and electricity, it's been papered over by the government subsidies. But, look, I mean, the thing about inflation, that the way inflation's measured by the Reserve Bank of Australia is it basically it measures a whole range of goods and services.
Yeah.
And that's called the CPI basket. And obviously within that basket, you have some areas that are rising quickly, and those are the things that people tend to notice. But there are always other parts of the basket which are falling, and they're not necessarily things that, you or I would buy or we necessarily care about, but they do weigh down inflation. So pretty much the story we've had for the last 20-odd years has been that one of the things that's kept inflation low for 20-odd years, other than this pandemic period, has been sort of the rise of China and China's industrial might, its manufacturing might, which has basically lowered the cost of anything that's come off a ship. So, we're talking about, clothing and electronics and, you're obviously old enough and so am I to remember when, buying a T-shirt used to go to Target or something back in the 90s, and buying a T-shirt used to cost like $20 in the 90s.
Yeah.
Whereas now you can go to Kmart and you buy one $5. Indeed. And obviously, and obviously money is, because of 20 years or 30 years worth of inflation, $5 now is the equivalent of probably $2 back then. And one of the reasons why those sorts of things have come down in cost. Another classic is AA, AAA batteries. Remember how expensive those used to be in the 80s and 90s? Now you can buy a 100 pack from Amazon for about $30.
That's all true. But, just on this score, yes, I've actually had people say to me, they like the cheap T-shirts. But the T-shirts back in the day were more expensive because...
Very quality.
Yeah, but also we used to make T-shirts. So people who made T-shirts had a job to go to, got paid the whole thing. It seems to me what's happened is we're all out of balance in so many ways. Would we be better, maybe doing the Trump thing here and putting some tariffs on and looking after ourselves? That would be a long haul project to do that. But were we better off then than now having the $2 T-shirts? Yeah,
well, I mean, certainly there's argument for that, and also there's also environmental argument. So one of the things that's been put to us currently is, Australia's got to cut its emissions to meet net zero and all that. But and all the advanced countries are doing the same thing. I mean, Trump's obviously walking back from that. But what they've actually done, advanced countries, is effectively sent their manufacturing over to China to do it instead.
Yes.
And in Australia's case, we're then sending our coal and gas to China to burn instead of us. And at the same time, we've given ourselves very expensive electricity, which is stupid because we're, the second biggest gas exporter in the world, the biggest coal exporter. We've got heaps of the stuff.
Yes.
And what that's done is it's basically shrunk our manufacturing. So all that ends up happening is the stuff that we could be burning at home on the cheap, we're sending to China to burn instead. And then we're then shuttering our manufacturing and sending that to China to then create instead of us. And then that's creating emissions over there. And obviously China doesn't have as big, stronger controls on emissions as we do. So net, the world's probably worse off. Getting more carbon emissions. The developed world is becoming less industrialised because they're basically sending their hydrocarbon energy, so coal and gas, etc., to China to burn instead of them. And they're also sending their manufacturing capacity to China to build instead of them. So, it's all a very interesting argument. For Australia's case, I don't think we need to necessarily go down the tariff route, but what we should certainly be doing, Mike, is we should be giving ourselves incredibly cheap energy because we should have the lowest energy prices in the world, and not including oil here. I'm talking about electricity and gas. And if we had that, which we should because we have oodles of the stuff, our manufacturing could then be more competitive because we'd have a cost advantage over the rest of the world. But through stupid policy, we've instead given ourselves, globally high gas and electricity prices, which has then made our industry less competitive. It's also given us a cost of living crisis. It's increased inflation. It's basically led to it's heightened Australia's deindustrialisation, which has then meant that we're just sending all the stuff over to China to do instead of us.
By the way, just on the clothing issue, the cheaper prices do come at a cost, if I can put it that way. I was talking to a woman on the program a couple of days ago, and she's a bit of a crusader for the fact that she's deeply concerned about the sort of clothing that's being bought through organizations like Temu, and they have these tiny, tiny little warning labels to satisfy the lawyers, if it comes to it, to tell the consumer that these things, apart from anything else, are highly flammable. So you got a garment, if it's a flappy garment, and Granny's sitting too close to the fire or the bar heater, or a little kid does that, and things like kids' capes and everything else, they are highly flammable, and some of them don't have any warnings at all because they're classified as toys, and some of them have these tiny, tiny warnings. So, I mean, that kind of degrades the way we're living in a fairly substantial way, potentially, doesn't it?
Oh, yeah, and it's not just that. It's also we've become a throwaway society. So, listeners have probably heard of the term fast fashion. So, because clothes have become so cheap and available, and you can buy, a T-shirt sometimes you can get for $2.
Right.
And they're very thin quality, they're poor, they're not made to last. And what it's effectively done is it's encouraged people to stock up on and have loads and loads of T-shirts, loads and loads of pairs of shoes, all this sort of stuff. Whereas we didn't have that. Like growing up in the 80s and 90s, as I did when I was a child and then teenager and young adult, you only had a few pairs of everything because it was so expensive, and you ended up looking after it, and it meant that ultimately you got less waste. Whereas I look nowadays, and all this stuff is just basically disposable junk, and people end up having way too much of it, and then it ends up, in landfill, etc. It just ends up contributing to waste. And this goes beyond clothing. This goes across the entire economy. You can go to one of those cheap sort of, they used to be $2 shops, not really $2 anymore, but those sort of cheap shops, and you can buy a whole bunch of toys. Yeah. For $10, you can come out with a whole heap of it. You couldn't do that 20, 30 years ago because all that stuff was expensive, and all it ends up doing is it just contributes to waste. Like, people end up with heaps of stuff they don't need, ends up getting thrown in the bin, ends up in landfill, ends up in the ocean as floating plastics, that sort of thing. And that's certainly been one of the major downsides of all this consumer stuff that comes off a container ship becoming uber cheap. And, basically, countries sending this stuff to China to make. And that is certainly one of the big downsides of society now. We're now a throwaway society. But at the same time, this is happening, Mike, the essentials, so things like your rent, your food, going to anything that requires a human being to perform, like a service, all that kind of stuff has become uber expensive. Our energy's become uber expensive, which is why households are, suffering this cost of living crisis, even though all this disposable junk, which you don't necessarily need, which comes off container ship, is now really cheap. So, the whole, they call it the tradable goods is what economists call it. So there's non-tradables and tradables. The tradables inflation has, totally collapsed. And it's actually, we got deflation there in a lot of areas. But the services or the non-tradable inflation, so that's all your domestically driven inflation, still, fairly high. But net, the Australian Bureau of Statistics did release inflation data on Wednesday, which showed that the trimmed mean inflation, so that's one the RBA looks at. That's the one that ignores the energy subsidies and the volatile items. That actually fell to 0.5% in the fourth quarter of 2024. And the 6-month annualised rate has now fallen to 2.65%, which is now within the Reserve Bank's target. So the upshot is that both this underlying inflation, this trim mean inflation, which is what the RBA looks at, and the headline inflation, which has been influenced by subsidies, are now tracking well below the Reserve Bank's forecast, November forecast. And Australia's trimmed mean inflation, the one that the Reserve Bank looks at, is now lower than the United States and Canada.
Okay.
And both the US and Canada are cutting rates. So what this means is that almost all economists now expect the Reserve Bank to cut interest rates at its next meeting, 18th of February. And it's going to be really hard for the Reserve Bank to resist cutting rates. And you can expect Treasurer Jim Chalmers, Prime Minister Anthony Albanese, etc., to really dial up the pressure on the RBA to cut rates now. Basically started knowing full well if they don't do it, they're going to struggle to win the upcoming election because, Australians are obviously feeling the pinch from, rents, energy, all this stuff you have to have, your necessities, the cost of living crisis. And, the Labor government is desperately hoping the Reserve Bank cuts interest rates, which this data sort of plays into their hands a bit.
Well, you're right. I mean, they're desperately hoping that, but just looking at some of your notes here, Australians have suffered their deepest decline in material living standards in modern history. Real per capita household disposable incomes collapsed by more than 8% since the Albanese government took office in 2022, the sharpest decline on record. Australia's decline in real per capita household disposable income has been among the worst in the advanced world, and failing real wages have underpinned the decline in Australia's real household disposable income. Australian real wages have fallen nearly 7% from their peak. So ultimately, okay, Jim and the PM are going to be up there pointing to these numbers, but anybody who's had to pay the higher rent, buy groceries lately and noticed the difference, they're still going to be susceptible to the call from Peter Dutton, aren't they? Are you really better off?
Absolutely. And this has been reflected in the polls. So pretty much every opinion poll that's come out recently has shown that the coalition's now leading Labor. So the margins vary. So some of them saying 51% to 49% two-party preferred. Some are saying 52 to 48. Yeah. But regardless, Labor's now trailing in the polls pretty much across every measure. A lot of that is based on this sort of data. So, as you just stated, Australians have real per capita household disposable income has fallen by 8%. Since the Albanese government took office in the middle of 2022. Now, that's the sharpest decline on record. It's the worst decline in the advanced world. And Deloitte Access Economics released its business outlook on Wednesday, and they forecast that Australian real wages won't recover to their former level until 2030.
Wow.
Now, I'll add though, Mike, Deloitte's forecasts are actually quite optimistic. So, the Reserve Bank's latest statement of monetary policy, they have wage price and inflation forecast in there. They only go to the end of 2026. But what the Reserve Bank's November forecast showed is that by the end of 2026, Australia's real wages will still be 6% below their peak, and they'll be tracking it at December 2011 levels. So we got ages to go to catch up. And in fact, what I did was I extrapolated using a straight line the trajectory using the RBA's forecast. And if you go by that, Australian real wages won't recover to their former peaks until mid-2030s.
Okay.
So that there would insinuate that Australians are facing a decade or perhaps 15 years whereby their living standards have fallen, which is unbelievable. So, could you imagine looking ahead 15 years from now and your wages after inflation are the same level as they are today or if not worse? So you've got less purchasing power than you do now in 15 years' time. That's the sort of situation we're looking at here.
There's a lot to be done, Leith. Anyway.
And mate, this is why the Albanese government is on the nose, and this is why they're praying that the RBA cuts interest rates, because if they cut interest rates, at least gives them some positive news heading into the elections. If they don't, I think they're cactus.
All right, Leith, appreciate your time and comments as always. Thank you very much for that.
Yeah, cheers, mate. Speak to you next time.
Okay, Leith Van Onselen, Chief Economist of the MB Fund and MB Super and co-founder of Macro Business.